Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we turn now in our study of Unit 1 to page 22, 23 and following. The Immigrant Contribution, an essay cutting that comes from John F. Kennedy's A Nation of Immigrants. Let's read a little bit about Kennedy to begin with on page 22. He was born into a family of politicians. His dates, 1917 to 1963. Kennedy didn't take schooling seriously and was known as a trickster in the classroom. In his junior year at Harvard, he developed an interest in political philosophy and he became more studious. After school, he served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. In 1961, he became the 35th President of the United States. And of course, tragically, Kennedy was assassinated November the 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Let's look at a little bit of background information on page 23. John F. Kennedy wrote the book from which this excerpt was taken when he was a United States Senator. He was a prominent supporter of immigrant rights and ran for president on a platform that included the extension of those rights. He opposed legal distinctions between native-born and naturalized citizens, saying, quote, "There is no place for second-class citizenship in America." He greatly influenced and inspired the immigration reforms of the late 20th century. Well, now, pay attention as we read along. What do good readers do? As we've often said, they scan the reading before they do the reading. So if you will, turn with me, and you'll notice that on page 28, the reading ends with 17 paragraphs. So this is a little bit longer reading, and so we really want to pay attention while we work, and then at the conclusion, we'll come back to work levels 1, 2, and 3 together.
The Immigrant Contribution, from A Nation of Immigrants by John F. Kennedy. Oscar Hamlin has said, "Once I thought to write a history of the immigrant in America. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history." In the same sense, we cannot really speak of a particular immigrant contribution to America, because all Americans have been immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. Even the Indians, as mentioned before, migrated to the American continent. We can only speak of people whose roots in America are older or newer. Yet each wave of immigration left its own imprint on American society. Each made its distinctive contribution to the building of the nation and the evolution of American life. Indeed, if, as some of the older immigrants like to do, we were to restrict the definition of immigrants to the 42 million people who came to the United States after the Declaration of Independence, we would have to conclude that our history and our society would have been vastly different if they all had stayed at home. As we have seen, people migrated to the United States for a variety of reasons. But nearly all shared two great hopes: the hope for personal freedom and the hope for economic opportunity. In consequence, the impact of immigration has been broadly to confirm the impulses in American life, demanding more political liberty and more economic growth. So, of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 18 were of non-English stock, and 8 were first-generation immigrants. 2 immigrants, the West Indian Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and the Swiss Albert Gallatin, who held the same office under Jefferson, established the financial policies of the young republic. A German farmer wrote home from Missouri in 1834, "If you wish to see our whole family living in a country where freedom of speech obtains, where no spies are eavesdropping, where no simpletons criticize your every word and seek to detect therein a venom that might endanger the life of the state, the church, and the home. In short, if you wish to be really happy and independent, then come here." Every ethnic minority, in seeking its own freedom, helped strengthen the fabric of liberty in American life. Similarly, every aspect of the American economy has profited from the contributions of immigrants. We all know, of course, about the spectacular immigrant successes. The men who came from foreign lands sought their fortunes in the United States and made striking contributions, industrial and scientific, not only to their chosen country, but to the entire world. In 1953, the President's Commission on Immigration and Naturalization mentioned the following: industrialists, Andrew Carnegie, Scott, in the steel industry; John Jacob Astor, German, in the fur trade, Michael Cudahy, Irish, of the meatpacking industry, the DuPonts, French, of the munitions and chemical industry, Charles L. Fleischmann, Hungarian, of the yeast business, David Sarnoff, Russian, of the radio industry, and William S. Knudsen, Danish, of the automobile industry. Scientists and inventors. Among those whose genius has benefited the United States are Albert Einstein, German, in physics, Michael Pupin, Serbian, in electricity, Enrico Fermi, Italian, in atomic research, John Ericsson, Swedish, who invented the ironclad ship and the screw propeller, Giuseppe Bellanca, Italian, and Igor Sikorsky, Russian, who made outstanding contributions to airplane development, John A. Udden, Swedish, who was responsible for opening the Texas oil fields, Lucas P. Kyrides, Greek, industrial chemistry, David Thomas, Welsh, who invented the hot blast furnace, Alexander Graham Bell, Scot, who invented the telephone, Conrad Hubert, Russian, who invented the flashlight, and Ottmar Mergenthaler, German, who invented the linotype machine. But the anonymous immigrant played his indispensable role too. Between 1880 and 1920, America became the industrial and agricultural giant of the world, as well as the world's leading creditor nation. This could not have been done without the hard labor, the technical skills, and the entrepreneurial ability of the 23.5 million people who came to America in this period. Significant as the immigrant role was in politics and in the economy, the immigrant contribution to the professions and the arts was perhaps even greater. Charles O. Paulin's analysis of the Dictionary of American Biography shows that, of the 18th and 19th century figures, 20% of the businessmen, 20% of the scholars and scientists, 23% of the painters, 24% of the engineers, 28% of the architects, 29% of the clergymen, 46% of the musicians, and 61% of the actors were of foreign birth, a remarkable measure of the impact of immigration on American culture. And not only have many American writers and artists themselves been immigrants or the children of immigrants, but immigration has provided American literature with one of its major themes. Perhaps the most pervasive influence of immigration is to be found in the innumerable details of life and the customs and habits brought by millions of people who never became famous. This impact was felt from the bottom up, and these contributions to American institutions may be the ones which most intimately affect the lives of all Americans. In the area of religion, all the major American faiths were brought to this country from abroad. The multiplicity of sects established the American tradition of religious pluralism and assured to all the freedom of worship and separation of church and state pledged in the Bill of Rights. So too, in the very way we speak, immigration has altered American life. In greatly enriching the American vocabulary, it has been a major force in establishing the American language, which, as H.L. Mencken demonstrated 30 years ago, had diverged materially from the mother tongue as spoken in Britain. Even the American dinner table has felt the impact. One writer has suggested that typical American menus might include some of the following dishes: Irish stew, chop suey, goulash, chili con carne, ravioli, knockwurst mit sauerkraut, Yorkshire pudding, Welsh rarebit, borscht, gefilte fish, Spanish omelet, caviar, mayonnaise, antipasto, Baumkuchen, English muffins, Gruyere cheese, Danish pastry, Canadian bacon, hot tamales, Wiener schnitzel, petit four, spumone, bouillabaisse, mate, scones, Turkish coffee, minestrone, filet mignon. Immigration plainly was not always a happy experience. It was hard on the newcomers, and hard as well on the communities to which they came. When poor, ill-educated, and frightened people disembarked in a strange land, they often fell prey to native racketeers, unscrupulous businessmen, and cynical politicians. Boss Tweed said, characteristically, in defense of his own depredations in New York in the 1870s, "This population is too hopelessly split into races and factions to govern it under universal suffrage, except by bribery of patronage or corruption." But the very problems of adjustment and assimilation presented a challenge to the American idea. a challenge which subjected that idea to stern testing and eventually brought out the best qualities in American society. Thus, the public school became a powerful means of preparing the newcomers for American life. The ideal of the melting pot symbolized the process of blending many strains into a single nationality. And we have come to realize in modern times that the melting pot need not mean the end of particular ethnic identities or traditions. Only in the case of the Negro has the melting pot failed to bring a minority into the full stream of American life. Today we are belatedly but resolutely engaged in ending this condition of national exclusion and shame and abolishing forever the concept of second-class citizenship in the United States. Sociologists call the process of the melting pot social mobility. One of America's characteristics has always been the lack of a rigid class structure. It has traditionally been possible for people to move up the social and economic scale. Even if one did not succeed in moving up oneself, there was always the hope that one's children would. Immigration is by definition a gesture of faith in social mobility. It is the expression and action of a positive belief in the possibility of a better life. It has thus contributed greatly to developing the spirit of personal betterment in American society and to strengthening the national confidence in change in the future. Such confidence, when widely shared, sets the national tone. The opportunities that America offered made the dream real, at least for a good many. But the dream itself was in large part the product of millions of plain people beginning a new life in the conviction that life could indeed be better, and each new wave of immigration rekindled the dream. This is the spirit which so impressed Alexis de Tocqueville, and which he called the spirit of equality. Equality in America has never meant literal equality of condition or capacity. There will always be inequalities in character and ability in any society. Equality is meant rather that, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. It is meant that in a democratic society, there should be no inequalities in opportunities or in freedoms. The American philosophy of equality has released the energy of the people, built the economy, subdued the continent, shaped and reshaped the structure of government, and animated the American attitude toward the world outside. The continuous immigration of the 19th and early 20th centuries was thus central to the whole American faith. It gave every old American a standard by which to judge how far he had come, and every new American a realization of how far he might go. It reminded every American, old and new, that change is the essence of life, and that American society is a process, not a conclusion. The abundant resources of this land provided the foundation for a great nation, but only people could make the opportunity a reality. Immigration provided the human resources. More than that, it infused the nation with a commitment to far horizons and new frontiers, and thereby kept the pioneer spirit of American life, the spirit of equality and of hope, always alive and strong. We are the heirs of all time, wrote Herman Melville, and with all nations we divide our inheritance.
One of the things that makes this such an interesting essay to read is the realization that we are reading a President of the United States. This is, of course, John F. Kennedy suggesting why it is the case that America is unique. And he will talk about the fact that the immigrant contribution is central to what it means to be an American. Now, he'll begin with Oscar Hanlon, who said, once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America, and then I discovered that the Americans were American history, this is where he begins. And of course, if all Americans are descendant from some kind of immigrant status, he says, at the conclusion of paragraph 1, that each of us, even the native, he calls them Indians, the native-born peoples, had to migrate to the American continent from some other place. Since this is the case, he says, the definition of immigrants, he says, if we were just to restrict it to the 42 million people who came to the United States after the Declaration of Independence, we have to conclude our history, our society would have been vastly different if everybody had stayed at home. This is fundamental to what it means if you're going to talk about America. By the way, note that within one paragraph in this essay, we've already got the mention of the Declaration of Independence. Why do we keep coming back to that document? Because it espouses the great dream. The notion, as we'll get to later in this essay, that all humans are created equal. Now, of course, we're going to get into the debate immediately, obviously, about what it means, because Jefferson didn't say all humans, he said all men, and of course, when he said all men, he had a certain understanding of what that meant. But of course, Kennedy and those to follow in Kennedy's tradition will say, Jefferson's words are way more important than Jefferson. There's an ideal, a dream will be the use of a word later. There's a dream, an ideal that is foundational to what it means to be an American. Notice that he will begin in paragraph 2 by talking about the two fundamental reasons that anybody came to America: economic opportunity and personal freedom. And these two together, of course, are foundational to understanding the power of immigrants in American history. He points out, speaking of the Declaration of Independence in paragraph 3, that of the 56 signers, he says, 18 were not of non-English stock and 8 were first-generation immigrants. He, in paragraph 4, says, every ethnic minority in seeking its own freedom helped strengthen the fabric of liberty in American life. Circle the word fabric. Take us back at 3A to the Anna Quendelin passage that we worked with before of the quilt of America. And there it is, fabric quilt, right? He then will, in paragraphs, starting in paragraph 5 and following, make the argument through data that, in fact, America was built, the economy, the industry, was all built around the immigrants who came to America. In paragraph 6, we talk about the industrialists like Carnegie and the DuPonts. In paragraph 7, we've got the scientists and the inventors, of course, from Einstein to Fermi and Alexander Graham Bell. In paragraph 8, he talks about the anonymous immigrants, those who between 1880 and 1920, 23.5 million people who came to America to develop and to help grow America. In paragraph 9, he talks about the artists, and he provides some statistics about any number of people who are a part of that immigrant movement. Of course, literature as well developed this way. In paragraph 10, he talks about the influence of immigration to be found in the innumerable details of life and customs brought by millions of people who never became famous. In paragraph 11, he talks about the power of religion. Notice in paragraph 11, all the major American faiths were brought to this country from abroad. This is an interesting idea, right? And yet, the Bill of Rights pledged a separation of church and state so that if you came to America, you could practice the religion of your choice. Language as well as food is talked about in paragraph number 12. By paragraph 13, however, Kennedy is ready to move. He's written now 12 paragraphs, and he's ready to move now to some of the obvious problems. Tweed, Boss Tweed, will say you can't run a people like this without all kinds of corruption and bribery. It's obvious that Kennedy would wish it to be otherwise. Paragraph 14, he does talk about the challenge. How is it possible that all these different people from all these different cultures can be brought to a single place and assimilated? And of course the answer has continued to be up until today, public schools. We will say it in 303 often this way: we are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, and of course the stories that we do reject. Of course, there are challenges because a large number of Americans came to America against their will. That is to say, of course, the black slavery that is a terrible mark on our nation's history. Kennedy is aware, though, that we've got to address these issues. We have to make sure that everyone has equal opportunities under the law. And in fact, that's where he goes in paragraph 15, talking about there will always be a hope of social mobility. He will in fact say in paragraph 15, it has thus contributed greatly to developing the spirit of personal betterment in American society and to strengthening the national confidence in change and the future. He says it, such confidence then, when widely shared, sets the national tone, and then he begins to talk about the American dream. Now, of course, by the time we get to our junior year of study, we are freshmen now, we'll be working with Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, and we'll be asking questions already in the early part of the 20th century about this notion of the American dream. Is it in fact real in any fundamental way? Of course, Kennedy's going to argue it's fundamentally, absolutely real. He uses de Tocqueville, who we mentioned in the Quindlen lecture, and Democracy in America as a classic example of the spirit of equality. Not that we are all the same, but rather we all have equal opportunity under the law. And again, he goes back to the Declaration of Independence to make his argument. Finally, he will finish by talking about the change that is the essence of life, and that American society is a process, not a conclusion. I hope that you marked that line. It's a great idea. America is a process, not a conclusion. And he quotes Herman Melville, the great author of Moby Dick. We are the heirs of all time, and with all nations we divide our inheritance. Well, let's work really quickly into what are we going to say for a major message or theme here? Obviously, the idea that we should all recognize the value of our country as being the place where opportunity exists, but we may also want to point out as one of the major themes or messages, we have a long way still to go to be able to provide equal opportunity for everyone. And to be what is rhetorically, in terms of rhetoric, what do we want to say here? Well, rhetorically speaking, we can talk about the symbolism of the fabric. We can talk about the ways, and let's put this in our notes, the ways that he validates using quotations from de Tocqueville to any number of other people. He even finishes his essay with a quote from Herman Melville. At 3A, let's ask, how can you relate this reading to the Anna Quindlen Quilt of America essay? What are the major films that argues the value of immigrants to